Okay, great. So good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Debbie Powell. I serve as the Deputy Associate Commissioner at the Family and Youth Services Bureau, affectionately known as FISB. We are at the Administration for Children and Families. I am also currently serving as the Acting Associate Commissioner for FISB. And I'm so honored to welcome everyone here today to this virtual event. Youth in Crisis, what the data is telling us. As you may know, in November, we acknowledge and celebrate National Runaway Prevention Month, which is an opportunity to raise awareness and education on the challenges that youth in crisis, youth who run away, and youth experiencing homelessness face in communities nationwide. These youth oftentimes remain invisible in our own communities as they seek support and temporary housing, sometimes on someone's couch, or make use of emergency shelters. Every day, youth at home, in schools, and in our communities face difficult situations that influence their decision to run away. Running away is often a coping mechanism used by youth to deal with overwhelming life situations. They run away to escape these situations without knowing that once on the streets, they put themselves at risk of homelessness. Every year, approximately 4.2 million youth and young adults experience homelessness in our country. These are very vulnerable youth who struggle with mental health challenges, physical and sexual abuse, and loneliness. They're often stigmatized when trying to find support and a safe place to sleep. In an effort to develop effective interventions to address running away incidents and youth homelessness, we must understand the problems these youth face that cause them to think running away is their only option. When we understand what prompts youth to run away, we will better equip ourselves to prevent running away incidents in the first place and redesign services to meet the needs of young people experiencing homelessness and housing instability. An important resource is the National Runaway Safe Line. The National Runaway Safe Line, NRS, operates the federally funded national communication system for runaway and homeless youth. Every year, through their hotline and digital services, NRS makes over 125,000 connections with young people. They're free, confidential, non-judgmental crisis prevention and intervention services and resources are aimed at preventing runaway incidents and supporting youth experiencing homelessness nationwide. This fall, the NRS released its 2020 Crisis Services and Prevention Report, which highlights the needs of the young people who reached out for crisis services throughout 2020. Many of these youth were contemplating running away, were on the run, or experiencing homelessness. The report illuminates some of the reasons why youth reach out to the NRS, the reasons why they run away, and the needs of homeless youth. The report also shares hopeful trends, such as an increase in the number of youth contacting NRS before running away. I'm very excited about this particular event today because data is so important in telling the story of youth homelessness. Data is a key in driving our service delivery, or it should be. Today's discussion is the story of thousands of youth who were seeking support. Behind each contact is a young person that felt they were out of options, but who had the courage to reach out to the NRS. The presenters will walk us through the data report and its implications for outreach, prevention, and intervention strategies for youth-serving organizations and communities. It is our hope that today's discussion can assist all who care about young people to better understand the youth who need our support and the importance of runaway prevention and intervention. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters for today, Susan Frankel, who serves as the Chief Executive Officer for the Runaway Safe Line, the National Runaway Safe Line, and Dr. Melissa Cole, who is a senior researcher at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. Thank you both for your efforts in creating the data report and for sharing these very important findings with us today. On behalf of the Family and Youth Services Bureau, thank you again for joining us today, and I am looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Debbie. We really appreciate your partnership and all of your support and the partnership with Family Youth Services Bureau. As Debbie mentioned, my name is Susan Frankel, and I am the CEO of the National Runaway Safe Line. I am excited to be joined by Dr. Melissa Cole from Chapin Hall. She'll be introducing herself in just a moment, but we are also fortunate to have joining us today Shanae Weems, who is also a member of the National Runaway Safe Line team and who is our National Director of Training and Quality Assurance. She's going to help facilitate our conversation today and ensure that we are moving forward and getting all of this good information out to all of you. But I'm going to just go over just a few quick housekeeping items as we get started. I know folks were coming in and are continuing to come in, but just as a reminder, we are recording this presentation and this session. The recording will be made available shortly after, as I believe actually there's some links that are being posted in the chat at the moment. So not only will the recording be made available, but all of the slides and the PowerPoint presentation as well. So no need to worry. And also if you have colleagues who are missing, they will be able to join later as well. Just as a reminder, we have a fairly large audience with us today. So if you can remain mute while you aren't speaking, it is super helpful for all of us as we continue to navigate our Zoom world together throughout the last couple of years. And then finally, we are looking forward to hearing from all of you and hearing your questions. Please feel free to use the chat function. We have a number of NRS team members that are keeping an eye out and tracking those questions. And certainly if you feel more comfortable and would like to send your question more directly to someone, please send it directly to Jeff Stern, and he will make sure that we address that as well. We have left some time at the end of the session to make sure that we are addressing those questions. But to get started, I want to dive in to things here. I'm going to tell you just briefly a little bit about the Safe Line and then turn it over to Melissa just to share a little bit more about Chapin Hall as well as youth homelessness in general. And then we'll really get into the heart of the discussion. But as Debbie Powell mentioned just a few minutes ago, this is essentially the culmination of our National Runaway Prevention Month celebration and events for the month of November, which is an occurrence or something that we have each and every year during the month of November. This has been a collective effort led by the Safe Line and in partnership with the Family Youth Services Bureau to really shine a light on the issues and challenges faced by young people and families across the country each and every day throughout the year, but a way to really highlight what is happening, what the needs are, and what we can do to further prevent the number of youth experiencing homelessness who are facing the difficult choice to leave home or to run away, and the myriad of challenges that are facing young people, particularly in light of the pandemic over the last number of years. But again, challenges that they face each and every day. This National Runaway Prevention Month allows us to highlight and shine a light on those issues, to lead a national conversation. We have been so fortunate. We have had hundreds of partners and communities lighting up buildings, sharing out events, advocating, using their voices, having young people involved throughout the country, which has been critical to our success in making and building out that national visibility and awareness. But the National Runaway Safe Line itself, which we're going to go to the next slide here, we do this 365 days a year. National Runaway Prevention Month is just one of those times where we're able to really amplify those voices and amplify what we do. But as Debbie also mentioned, we do serve as the federally supported and funded national communication system for youth who are experiencing crisis, or experiencing homelessness, or who may have run away or are thinking and considering running away. Our mission as an organization overall is to ensure that America's runaway, homeless, and at-risk youth are safe and off the streets. We are making nearly or more than 125,000 crisis connections on an annual basis. And I'm going to share a little bit more about our services in just a moment. But really what we are here for is we are in existence. We are here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, round the clock, to make sure that there is a live voice, a live help on the other end of the phone, or a live chat, or other digital services that we offer to ensure that young people who are experiencing crisis have access to the resources, the support, and the services that are available throughout the country. And we are here to ensure that we're connecting those young people to what they need. And then we are here in the moment in time when they need a listening ear and a helpful voice as they work through what the next steps and what their next journey may look like. So as we move on to the next slide, just to give you a little bit of a brief overview of the National Runaway Safe Line and the services we offer, in particular through the National Communication System. As I mentioned, we do provide 24/7 crisis intervention and support services that are trauma-informed, solution-focused crisis intervention. And we focus primarily, we really serve as a conduit to information, referrals, services, and resources that exist from many of you that are provided and available throughout the country, but we are a connecting place, a way for young people to work through what is happening for them and how they link to those services and resources. We offer a myriad or a menu of options, including things that help facilitate open dialogue, connections, perhaps back with family members or to other connections or people who may offer more stable and sustainable housing or support services in the future for them, including a message service, our conference calls, which is also equivalent to a bit of mediation as well. And then our Home Free program, which is a national partnership with Greyhound bus services that allows us to work with young people to reunite with family, guardians, or other alternative, safe, stable living, long-term living arrangements. In addition to our hotline, so our 1-800-runaway.org hotline, we offer an interactive live chat, digital services, our online forum and email, and then we do offer texting right now, which is really a conduit to more information and resources, but we are, fingers crossed, getting much closer to operating a live text system, which we are looking at toward the end of this calendar year or early next year. In addition to that, we have a whole arm of services and support that we offer that make available free educational and promotional materials and a 14-module, again, free downloadable Let's Talk prevention curriculum, all available on the 1-800-runaway.org website, and all made available for free. So with that, I'm gonna stop talking and give Melissa an opportunity. Actually, I'll let Shanae introduce herself quickly, and we'll get her into the mix here, and then we'll keep things going as we jump into the heart of our conversation.
Hello all, thank you, Susan. As Susan mentioned, I'm Shanae Weems, and I will just kind of help moderate and guide the conversation today. So Susan has given a great introduction to NRS and who we are and the services that are offered and provided. So I want to take the time to turn it over to Melissa, Dr. Melissa Cole, so that she can just kind of talk more about Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago and give a little bit of background on Chapin Hall, and then we'll get into the conversation around the research.
Thank you so much, Shanae. Thank you, Susan. So as they both mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about Chapin Hall and our organization. I should also mention I'm a senior researcher at Chapin Hall, where my portfolio primarily focuses on family and youth homelessness. So I'll tell you a little bit about Chapin Hall as an organization, and then we'll jump into some of the bigger pieces of the report. So Chapin Hall is a nonprofit research institute, and our explicit mission is to improve the well-being of children, youth, and families in their communities. Our main goal is to build bridges across systems, and we try to bring data analysis and research evidence to bear in our work. Ultimately, what we're doing is working with organizations, with agencies, and policymakers to help develop systems and structures that promote the well-being of children, youth, and families. Over the past 2 years, we worked closely with the Safe Line to help process and analyze their crisis intervention data so that NRS and others can start to better understand what young people are going through, what puts them at risk for becoming homeless, and to be better situated to meet the needs of these young people. Next slide, please. So I want to share a few findings from the Voices of Youth count, which will help set the stage for this conversation about youth homelessness. If you haven't heard of the Voices of Youth count, it was a national policy research initiative that we assembled at Chapin Hall in around 2016. And the impetus for this work is that there were major gaps in our understanding of youth homelessness. And prior to the initiation of Voices, the research had generally been unclear on what characteristics make a young person more likely to be at risk for homelessness. We also didn't have a clear sense of how many young people were experiencing homelessness or what systems needed to do to prevent and end youth homelessness. So there's a lot of information on our website. You can check out chapinhall.org or voicesofyouthcount.org. And you'll find a lot of information there about the methodology for Voices of Youth Count. So I'm not going to go into that today, but I do want to set the stage a little bit with some of the top level findings that came out of that work. What we learned from Voices is that youth homelessness is a broad and hidden challenge. So we understand now that there are over 4 million youth and young adults between the ages of 13 and 25 who experience some form of homelessness each year. That means 1 in 10 young adults ages 18 to 25 and 1 in 30 youth ages 13 to 17 are experiencing some form of unaccompanied homelessness each year, and that does include couch surfing. I think most alarmingly, what we saw was that about half of youth who reported experiencing homelessness each year were actually experiencing it for the first time. And so as we think about this population, it's particularly concerning because we know that experiences of homelessness can be traumatic and that sustainably exiting from homelessness is a real challenge. Next slide, please. Okay, so I also want to highlight these findings because this is really important to keep in mind about the population of young people experiencing homelessness. We know from our work in Voices that there are major disparities in who's more likely to experience homelessness. And so you can see in the figure on the left, we disaggregated rates of homelessness by race and ethnicity. So you can see that young people who are identifying as white or non-Hispanic had the lowest rates of homelessness, whereas youth who identified as Hispanic or Black had almost twice the rate of homelessness as their white counterparts. And then youth who identified as American Indian or Alaskan Native experienced almost 3 times the rate of homelessness as white youth. And these disparities become even more stark when we attend to these intersectional identities and we overlay race and ethnicity with sexual orientation and gender identity. So you can see here in the second figure that youth who are identifying as both Black and LGBTQ experience 4 times the rate of homelessness as compared with their white, heterosexual, and cisgender counterparts. And so as we move forward through this conversation, I think it's really important to keep in mind that young people who are experiencing marginalization in their communities and in their families are really at the highest rates, are experiencing homelessness at the highest rates. And so now having set the stage, I'll turn it back to Shanae and Susan to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19.
Thanks for that information, Melissa. So as she stated, we're going to move now into just kind of, before we really dig into the numbers, is talking about how COVID impacted youth homelessness. Susan?
All right. So as Debbie Powell mentioned in her introduction, she really talked about how being able to use data helps us to tell a story and to really present a picture and a clearer understanding of what has been happening around youth experiencing homelessness or youth experiencing crisis, what we can learn from that story, and then what kind of changes we can make, how it can influence and impact service delivery. And so there's a little bit that we wanted to share. What we, as an organization, the National Runaway Safe Line, has nearly on an annual basis done some sort of trend or data report. Over the last couple of years, and in working more closely with Melissa and the Chapin Hall team, we've been able to really zero in on how we're using that report, how we're looking at the data, and how we're learning more about the story. And so this particular year of the 2020 data and the story that we're able to tell as we looked at the impact of COVID-19 in general for the National Runaway Safe Line, I think is an important sort of stage to set, or an important part of this story. Because when we think back, as we know for everybody, if you think back to March of 2020, it was a very, very quick, swift, immediate change for all of us, that none of us knew exactly where we were going, what we were doing, what was going to happen, or that we would still be talking about it at this moment. But it was a very swift and broad-reaching impact for young people, and particularly youth who were already experiencing homelessness, who were facing the prospect of homelessness, or potentially thinking about running away, or were in very precarious situations at home. And so as that happened, and literally overnight, what we saw were some of the formal and informal supports that were sort of made up the web, or the network of systems that were helping to hold up or provide access to some of the resources and services that youth may have needed, quickly shut down in many ways. So some of those things changed. We really saw very quickly that there were limits to no ability of shelter resources in different parts of the country. And we saw this change and ebb and flow as things changed, as we learned more, or as COVID-19 spread around the country. Particularly in the beginning, but actually throughout the pandemic, certainly access to transportation, to safe housing and shelter was an immediate need, an overwhelming need, and one that we continue to grapple with, which is why programs like Home Free are so critical. And of course, seeing a heightened anxiety and stressors around limited access to some of those support systems that have long been in place, that some of us may not even always think about, which is going to school every day, and the people and the adults and the things that exist to provide young people support, both formal and informal, that they need, drop-in centers, and access to things like case management and other resources. But thinking about being on lockdowns, or having to really stay at home more than any of us really ever had, and consider being in living arrangements that then really left young people really confined to very difficult circumstances and situations, potentially living with abusers or other unsafe living conditions, without as many options or as many ways to think about making a change or finding safe alternatives. And then finally, which was really key, as we took a very quick and swift look at what we were going to do as an organization, the difficulty navigating and understanding and tracking those available resources across the country was incredibly chaotic at times, was overwhelming, and was incredibly significant. And as a national hotline and serving as a national communication system, we really very early understood that the National Runaway Safe Line was in a key position to really help, to take on that role, and to really see what role we would be able to play. And again, to sort of amplify what we already knew we were able to do. So we were able to do a few things in response to this, which I think really helped set the stage for why we were so looking forward to the 2020 data report, and seeing if it not only kind of confirmed what we anecdotally were experiencing or what we were seeing, but could it help us even make more immediate and long-term changes and adjustments to better serve youth experiencing crisis? And so some of the things that we were able to do were to really update some of the technology, to expand the platforms and the robustness of those platforms so that we could do a better job communicating with the youth and families that we serve, with providers that we work with, making all of our systems more accessible and easy to manage, but to also really be able to access data in a more readily and easy way so that we could get the information not only for ourselves, but really more importantly, to be able to share it out with all of you. We really looked and took a very significant role in expanding and updating the national database for resources and referrals that we have. We knew that we were a critical access point throughout the pandemic. It's very hard if you're in Des Moines, Iowa, to keep track of what's happening in New York City. And kids were still traveling, people were still moving around or being stranded in different places. And we were able to really take on that role of facilitating that information. But we knew that we had to enhance the kind of training and information and access to resources we're providing for our crisis services team, including the significant focus on mental health, vicarious trauma, suicide prevention, and human trafficking. And that we also really needed to take a very significant look at how we were conducting the outreach, engagement, and education that we were doing. Were we just going to continue to do it in traditional ways, or did we need to kind of change what we were doing, make adaptations, which were really significant in addressing the digital world? We needed to go to where young people are, not have them come to us, but go to them, and to really look at how we were using our website, social media, and other digital platforms to make this happen, which then led us to the 2020 Crisis Data Report, which Melissa's going to take the deep dive on and walk us through in just a minute. And again, I just want to lay out one of the big things when we met with Melissa as we were getting ready. We turned over our data and we were sort of anxious about what would it tell us, is what were we experiencing and what we were seeing through our crisis services systems and communication platforms. All of that anecdotal experience, was it true? Was it really what we were seeing? Was it telling the same, would it tell the same story that we felt we were trying to tell? And would it lead to some of the answers we needed? And would it lead to more questions so that ultimately down the road, we would do a better job of providing the support, services, and resources that young people need across the country? So with that said, I will leave it and turn it over to Melissa.
Before Melissa starts, I want to interject and just remind you guys to go ahead and use the chat for questions as we dive into the numbers. You can send questions directly to Jeff Stern, and you can search for him throughout the chat because there's quite a few of us on here today. So with that being said, Melissa.
All right, thanks for that lead in, Susan and Shanae. Okay, so let's dive in. Susan really gave you all a sense of what the goal of this report was. We wanted to figure out who was reaching out for services and try to understand their characteristics so that we could help inform this work going forward. So let me provide a little bit of background about how NRS collects data. There are two data collection forms, one for information that contacts share when they call the hotline or reach out through the email or forum. And then there's a second form used for information collected through the chat service. Neither of these forms are standardized tools or interviews. So NRS is only able to collect information that contacts voluntarily disclose. This means that some contacts might not share information about their race, ethnicity, others might not share information about where they're staying or how they're surviving. Ultimately, this creates some data challenges in terms of varying amounts of missing data across different items. If you've had a chance to dig into the report, you probably saw a reference to this, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about it at the end of this talk. And as Susan mentioned, one innovation we did add to the report this year was to look more carefully at trends that were emerging between 2019 and 2020 to try to get a handle on what was happening for young people with regard to COVID and their experiences or their risks for homelessness. All right, next slide, please. Okay. So in terms of creating the report, I mentioned that NRS is focused on collecting self-report data. The data that we worked with had almost 37,000 contacts that came in through the hotline, chat service, and forum. And these are all for youth under the age of 22. We did some data cleaning to reduce the records, and ultimately our final sample was 36,107. And we conducted a basic descriptive analysis just to look at how young people were answering these questions. And so you can see on the right-hand side here, these are the questions that we tried to understand. And I think we've already covered essentially what we were trying to do with this report. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide has some quick takeaways. I'm going to dig into these in more detail and depth over the next few slides, but I do want to highlight a couple things here that I think we'll come back to, especially as we get into the questions. So I think it's important to know that one of the big findings that came out of this was that the sheer volume of contacts that NRS received in 2020 was much larger than that in 2019. Most of the youth who did reach out to NRS were advocating on their own behalf. Many of the youth who reached out to NRS in 2020 were younger than contacts in previous years. Most were still living at home, and there did seem to be a greater reliance on accessing NRS through these digital methods. So if you want to look more carefully at these tables, you can take a look there in the report, and we will continue to talk through these findings. Next slide, please. Okay, so for each of the next few slides, I'm going to present the findings from 2020 in a figure on the left-hand side, and then a quick snapshot of the differences that emerged between 2019 and 2020 on the right-hand side. So this slide is looking at the age of contacts who reached out to NRS. In 2020, we know that nearly half of the contacts were between the ages of 15 and 17, and almost 20% were between the ages of 12 and 14. So together, what this is showing is that 70% of contacts who disclosed their age in 2020 were minors. And the figure on the right-hand side shows that there was a large jump in the number of contacts under the age of 12, as well as under the age of 15. Ultimately, between 2019 and 2020, we saw an increase of 53% in contacts under the age of 15. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide shows how contacts connected with NRS. So as I noted earlier, you can see on the left-hand side a very clear preference for the service. More than half of contacts relied on that approach to connecting with NRS, followed by about 30% of contacts who used the hotline. Interestingly, we know from some additional analyses that we've done that there's a connection with age here. So what we know is that younger contacts really prefer to reach out to NRS using the chat service, and older contacts are typically relying on the hotline. And as I've already alluded to, we do see an increase between 2019 and 2020 in the number of contacts connecting through the chat service. Ultimately, there were more than 2,500 additional contacts using the chat service in 2020 than there were in 2019, and that's an increase of about 16%. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide shows how contacts learned about NRS. You can see here that the internet is very popular in terms of how contacts learned about NRS and its services. There was a much smaller percentage of individuals reaching out because they learned about NRS through word of mouth or through a social service agency. And there were also some contacts who were simply following up from a previous call. You can see in the figure on the right that there were nearly 5,000 more contacts who reported finding NRS through the internet in 2020 than there were in 2019, and that's an increase of 33%. Next slide, please. So this slide presents information on why contacts were reaching out to NRS for crisis intervention services. And this is, I think, where we can really start to take some of these findings into the work that we're doing day in and day out. You can see in this figure on the left, the top 4 reasons why contacts reported reaching out to NRS for crisis intervention services. It's important to note that the options here were not mutually exclusive. So contacts were provided a list of different options and they could check multiple options. So these are not mutually exclusive. But what we do see is that family dynamics are far and away the most common presenting problem. Nearly 90% of contacts reported concerns in this domain. So family dynamics include things like conflicts with rules, problems with siblings, teen parenting, or the death or loss of a caregiver, amongst other potential explanations. This was followed by emotional abuse and peer and social problems, which about 30% of contacts reported, followed by mental health, which about a quarter of contacts indicated was a concern. And so I want to highlight mental health in particular. I know there's a lot of literature and research out there about the impact of COVID-19 on mental health. And what we saw analyzing these data is that between 2019 and 2020, there was a very notable uptick in contacts citing family dynamics and mental health as reasons for reaching out to NRS. In particular, reports of mental health concerns increased by 30%. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide shows the location where contacts were staying when they reached out to NRS for support. And this, I think, also has really important implications for the work that we do. The figure on the left shows that the majority, almost 70% of contacts, reported that they were still at home, that young people were still at home, which makes sense, right? Given that the pandemic kept a lot of young people home in unsafe and unstable homes. And I think both Debbie and Susan alluded to this. Yeah, I think, sorry, I think if we could all mute, that would be really helpful. So the pandemic really was a time when young people might have been had it not been for the pandemic, young people might have been couch surfing, they might have tried to find somewhere else to stay, but as a result, they may have ended up staying at home in a place that wasn't safe or wasn't stable. And so this finding really points to the importance of prevention and intervention services, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And then the figure on the right shows possibly that this explanation might hold true, that we saw a 27% increase between 2019 and 2020 in contacts reaching out to NRS while they were still living at home. Okay, next slide, please. So Susan highlighted earlier that finding, locating, and accessing resources during the pandemic was really challenging for a lot of young people. So the way NRS works is that after contacts connect with NRS's frontline staff and volunteers, and they've had the opportunity to explain the issues that they're experiencing, they can then discuss services, resources, and supports that might help them to resolve or alleviate the crisis that has led them to reach out to NRS in the first place. So in 2020, NRS's frontline staff and volunteers had conversations with nearly 27,000 contacts about the options for referrals and how to resolve these crises that they were experiencing. This means that they talked to about 74% of all the contacts that NRS had in terms of what they could do, what next steps were. Ultimately, staff made referrals for over 16,000 contacts, and this is actually 500 more referrals made in 2020 as compared to 2019. Most of these referrals were for NRS services, which, as Susan mentioned earlier, include things like the messaging and conference call programs. These referrals also included connections with friends and other family members, for outreach to the police in situations concerning violence, and to alternate youth housing programs, among some others, but these were the most common types of referrals that we saw. Okay, next slide, please. So Susan also mentioned Home Free, which I'll quickly talk about. This program, as you know, helps to connect young people experiencing homelessness with a free bus ride to either their homes of origin or to a safe and alternate living situation. In 2020, we saw that NRS made referrals to Home Free for about 1,400 contacts, and almost 60% of those contacts followed up. Ultimately, there were 323 tickets issued through the Home Free program, most of which went to youth. Some of the issues that we know interfere with the receipt of a ticket amongst contacts who did want to pursue this program include things like the youth and the family not being able to reconcile their differences, the youth finding other modes of transportation, or transportation not being available in some locations. So just to provide a couple examples for why there might not have been more tickets issued through this program. So that is the bulk of the findings we'll talk about today. There are more findings in the report, and I encourage you to take a look. But for now, I will pause and I will turn it back to Susan and Chang.
Thanks, Melissa, for breaking down the numbers of the report. If you guys are following the chat, some of the questions that you all have asked, specifically with numbers or specific numbers of the report, Christopher directed you guys to the link with specifically page 9 that can give you a little bit more detailed information on very specific numbers in the report, but we can take a minute to answer some of these as well as Susan move into talking about the crisis report and just kind of the implications of what the numbers are telling us as it relates to COVID and just in general in comparison from 2019 to present day.
Thanks, Janae. I think there were just maybe one or two questions that are more of data specific that I just want to make sure we just take a second to address. One of which I think was the question about whether or not we're able to track if young people in foster care have reached out. What I want to note is we do have ways that we track wherever the youth is. You know, we ask that question. What I will note is we don't always get the answer. So, and particularly for a youth in foster care, they may not tell us or may not feel comfortable in telling us. We spend a fair amount of time then talking about just making sure they are somewhere safe and they are in a place where they are able to communicate with us. And we may get to that information down the road, but I do want to just emphasize that. There was also a question about how the number of youth calling from home compared to 2019. And I believe, Melissa, correct me if I'm wrong, we were nearly at around 70% of the youth who contacted the Safe Line during 2019 were reaching out to us from home or whatever their kind of place that they were defining as home was. So it was a pretty significant increase on that front as well, but wanted to call those couple of questions out. And we will get to some of the other questions as we move along. I don't know if there's anything else that I missed there that we should address. Shanae, should I just keep us going?
So one just came in that we might want to address right now. Any tracking on victims of sex trafficking, and if so, were the referrals made specifically for that?
Sure. So we track both. So we track whether or not that would be a reason. So human trafficking, sex trafficking, labor trafficking might be a reason that a young person is reaching out to us, and or we will capture that we are able to break down and look at the types of referrals and resources that we provide. So that would be captured there. Not all of those very, very specifics are necessarily highlighted in this report, but we are able to certainly pull some of that and pull that for specific areas even of the country. What I do want to note with human trafficking and labor trafficking, again, as Melissa sort of emphasized in the beginning, we are dependent upon what young people are willing to share and to disclose. And for many of you who work with victims of human trafficking, you know that is not always something that is easily disclosable or something that young people in particular, feel comfortable sharing with us immediately in an initial connection. And so we capture what we know, we capture what we're told. We do train our team to understand what some of the signs or some of the other language that is being used may indicate, and capture it that way. But we don't always know. We also are very committed to making sure that our crisis services and the needs of the young person on the other end of that call or chat or email, that they are sort of driving that conversation and that intervention. And so I share sometimes a very simple example, which is if a youth calls us and wants help finding food, while we may know that there could be a whole list of other needs that youth might have, if that is what they have identified as what they're looking for and what they need, we will do our best to provide them with that resource and certainly offer and try to expand the conversation. But we really work to ensure that the young person is driving that conversation. So with that said, I'm going to take what Melissa just shared and sort of highlight a couple of things as we move into, okay, so what does that mean? What is this data then? What do we do with it, and how do we translate it into service delivery and changes, challenges, discussion, and questions? And as I mentioned at the beginning before Melissa dived in, this is about telling a story. And we certainly had questions that we wanted answered as we went into looking at the 2020 data. And part of it was we also wanted to know what we thought we were experiencing anecdotally, in fact, true. And then what, if so, what does that mean? And what do we do with that as an organization going forward? And really as a larger community, providing resources, support, and services to youth experiencing homelessness or who have run away or in crisis. So certainly just to recap, our context skewed younger. And we certainly felt that on the lines and recognize that digital services are continuing to be and are becoming increasingly popular, as coming as no surprise in many ways. That is the reality of the world that we live in. And we know that this was sort of reaffirmed by the data, that we really did feel a shift. Our team was feeling that shift, particularly around the family dynamics and mental health concerns that young people were expressing. I do want to just share out a little nugget, which is for us, mental health as a reason for reaching out to the Safe Line had never previously been in even the top 10 reasons that young people were reaching out to us. It's now in our top 4. So the landscape has significantly changed, and I think the researcher and Melissa will tell me and tell others, we're sort of, that's conjecture. We can't entirely say it's linked to one thing or another, but it's something that we're paying close attention to and is really going to help drive even some of the questions we ask in 2021. But certainly more context for reaching out from home, not necessarily a surprise, but also really a highlight and emphasizing the importance of prevention and very early intervention and the opportunities that we all have in front of us with this knowledge. And then really, again, that greater need. I want to just note, it wasn't only assistance finding and understanding what resources were out there, but our team was doing a lot more advocacy on behalf of young people who needed to reach and access those resources. So by that, I mean a lot more outbound calling, a lot more of us reaching out to make sure, were the services available? Were they still operating the same hours? Did they still have the same guidelines? What criteria had they put in place in response to COVID-19? And a sort of again, those kinds of pieces were really, okay, wow, I've already got a 5-minute warning, so I got to talk fast. So we're going to keep going. So what are the key learnings and what other kinds of recommendations can we add as we kind of move forward? Going to move past, this is just another visual. So one of the big things and really important was we took to heart the need to really look at how we were using digital services, and in particular, what we were doing around social media, and really ensuring how we were using these tools to engage young people and really to let youth know that we were here and existing and sort of what was available to them. And so we were able to, throughout kind of in the early or sort of late part of December, and then for part of 2021, we launched 2 different national campaigns, specifically and exclusively on social media channels. We're going to go to the next slide so I can just give you a quick peek. This was just a landing page that was developed as part of these campaigns. It's still available on the website. We'll provide links just to give you a taste. And then we're going to quickly go to the next slide just to highlight some of the key messaging. These were also all translated into Spanish language slides as well. But this just gives you an idea of what it looked like. But what we learned from this, and we'll go to the next one, the platforms that we used, so these were certainly not geared at me or Melissa or Shanae. This was to really reach young people where they live and where they are at. So we primarily focused on TikTok, Snapchat, YouTube, and Instagram. And you can see from the numbers that we made a pretty significant dent in the kinds of outreach, the impressions that we were able to achieve as a result of the campaign. Just to remind you, the difference between the impressions is that the ads or the engagement was seen. The clicks are when somebody clicks on it and goes through and actually takes it a little further, so to our website or to that landing page. You can see that TikTok was the most effective platform that we used. None of this was, quite frankly, surprising to us after what we've learned. But the beauty of all of these platforms was also that we were able to very specifically target them. So we were able to target certain age groups. We were able to use the data from the data report from the 2020, and this is so important. And what Debbie was talking about, we weren't sort of just shooting arrows in the dark. We were using the data, which really guided us to say we should focus on 15 to 17-year-olds. We were looking to really make sure we were reaching certain underserved communities and really reaching states that were heavily impacted by COVID-19. And communities and cities across the country were based on our own data, where we were receiving the contacts and where we were seeing youth reach out to us. We were there trying to make sure we were continuing to serve those areas, or in those places and spaces where we weren't receiving many contacts, to really use this platform and use this these systems to reach those areas. So a couple of, let's jump into some recommendations here. So around social media, just to emphasize, it's really important that young people are involved in this process, that they're involved in the messaging, what's being used is something that appeals to young people. So that is one of the key pieces, but also remembering it doesn't matter if we use these social media platforms ourselves or as providers or as adults. We have to go and speak and interact and interface with youth where they are, where they're looking for information, where they want to be, and where they are most comfortable, because that will translate into being more comfortable in engaging and reaching out to services and support systems like the National Runaway Safe Line, because we are reflecting back what they are telling us. And then I think it's really important to emphasize, we cannot expect overnight results. You don't put an ad on TikTok and then immediately get an additional 20,000 crisis calls the next day. This is definitely a marathon. This is not a 5K. This is a very long journey, which has to do with establishing our presence, having our information recognized, our name recognized, our ads appealing, and young people knowing when they need us, which could be today, tomorrow, or in a few months. They remember, they've seen it, and they go, and it's a repetitive process that they really know how to find us. So a few other kind of recommendations and things to consider from this data and what we are taking truly to heart as we move to the next slide. So I think we've kind of talked about the importance around digital connections and social media to really provide an effective continuum of care. I'm going to sort of go out on a limb here. I think it's very difficult in today's world now to provide support and services and outreach to youth experiencing crisis without including some component that is internet, digitally based, or social media based. We know that it is critical that we have a large network of community-based partners. We know that schools, after-school organizations, and even local businesses, things like libraries, coffee shops, restaurants, are incredibly key for building the robust sort of community-wide support system that young people need. We know that the kinds of referrals and resources, they need to accommodate many age ranges and groups, but we really have to, as a larger network and a network serving runaway and homeless youth, be considering those kinds of options for youth under the age of 12 and certainly older than the age of 21. And that really we need to be emphasizing particularly more training, more services, more resources around mental health, suicide prevention, and the social and emotional development are essential. This again is not necessarily played out in the research, but we are hearing this, seeing this, and feeling this at the National Runaway Safe Line level on the crisis lines. Young people have experienced incredible trauma over the last couple of years as a result of COVID, and they have experienced a lot of loss and a lot of disconnect from some of those traditional places and spaces that lead to how they develop social connections and how they develop just general connections in the world. And it's going to be key that we recognize how we support this going forward. And then I think it's now time for me to turn it over to Melissa.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, so I have a few final thoughts, particularly related to prevention and intervention research, which Chapin Hall is working really hard on at the moment, as well as many others. So we talked a bit about home free. We're still learning what it takes to reunify and strengthen families. But we know that programs like home free help youth to overcome burdens like transportation and distance. And those things are key to bringing families back together to help resolve the issues that led to homelessness in the first place. So a program like Home Free is really critical to ensuring that young people can get access to safe housing options when they're in positions where, or living situations where they feel unsafe or they know they won't be safe. And so I think as a field, particularly those of us who are doing research in this space, we need to continue exploring how to best inform young people of these programs in terms of messaging. We need to evaluate their effectiveness, and we need to figure out how to scale them appropriately. The other finding that such a large proportion of young people were at home when they reached out to NRS for support really points to this emphasis on prevention and primary intervention services. So I know Chapin Hall is doing a lot of work in this space, as well as many others. There are so many exciting and promising programs being implemented across the country, and it's so encouraging to see so much investment from funders and others engaged in these activities and investing in these opportunities. And so as researchers, we want to continue to test and rigorously evaluate these types of programs so that we can figure out what's working best for both preventing youth homelessness where it's possible, and when it's not possible to prevent, to ensure that experiences of homelessness for young people are both brief and one time. And then finally, I think these findings really point to the importance of developing and implementing data systems that are going to reflect how young people see themselves, how they understand themselves. And so this has been a challenge for NRS, given that young people who connect with the frontline staff and volunteers, all of the information, as Susan mentioned, and I've talked a bit about as well, is voluntary. So we have to imagine that young people who are experiencing marginalization in their families or their communities as a result of their identities might be reluctant to disclose information about themselves to a stranger on the other end of a phone line or an online chat service. So we need to know who these young people are so that we can accurately assess their needs and strengths and ensure that they're receiving supports and resources that affirm their identities. We also need to continue understanding how young people feel most comfortable reaching out and whether there might be other avenues to connecting young people with these resources, as Susan's mentioned, related to the social media campaigns, so that all young people in need of supports can obtain access to them. And then just one final point, I think it's fair to say that on behalf of NRS and Chapin Hall, we feel really confident in these data and what they tell us about youth experiencing or at risk of homelessness. And we think the insights we've shared today can really help to shed light, not only for service providers, but also for other stakeholders, including those working in community-based systems, funders, and researchers. And we think that there are lots of conversations that will emerge in response to these findings that can help us as a field figure out the most optimal ways to support young people to both avoid homelessness or sustainably exit homelessness so that they can advance their lives and pursue the opportunities that motivate them. So I'll stop there, and I think Shanae is going to take it from here.
So thank you both, Susan and Melissa, for going through a very lengthy report in a short period of time and highlighting some key points and key findings, and just kind of detailing out the implications and recommendations that has come out of that report. The link has been posted in the chat again to view the full report. So now we're going to just open it up to questions. There were quite a few questions in the chat, so you guys aren't shy. If you have some questions, feel free to post it in the chat and we'll answer them. I'll give you guys a second. So one question that I have is, what are the implications of the data collection being that all information is voluntary and is self-reported? So
do you want, I'll jump in, Melissa, and then have you expand on it. One of the things that we're talking a lot about from the Safe Lines perspective is, are we asking the right questions? Are we asking them in the right way? Are we asking them in a way that the youth who are reaching out to us feel safe? Are we asking them in ways that feel culturally aware and culturally competent and addressing sort of the various places and spaces and backgrounds that the young people and families who are reaching out to us have experienced? And that it's very important for us to first and foremost ensure that young people feel safe and comfortable when they reach out to us. And it's also so important that we're designing our services to meet the varying needs. So it's kind of a bit of a catch, but we know that we're spending a lot of time just really trying to dive in. Are we doing that piece of our work in the right way? And how do we improve it? But how do we improve it without it jeopardizing the kind of engagement and relationships that we seek to build in a very short window of time that sometimes happens without us ever even knowing the name of the youth that we're talking to? And so it's all of those dynamics that come into play, but we think it's a really critical piece that's come out of, we started this conversation really, Melissa, correct me if I'm wrong, in 2019. This was one of the key pieces we started talking about. How do we do better?
Yeah, it's super challenging. And from a research perspective, having missing data is never a good thing, right? You really want to understand who the individuals are who are reaching out, what they're experiencing. The more you know about the individuals in your data set, the more you can extrapolate important findings that then benefit the community more broadly. So Susan's really pointed to all the big questions that NRS is grappling with regarding data collection. And just from the research perspective, these are things that we're always concerned about and always want to help organizations do better.
Thank you both. So another question that we had was, how do we suggest NRS to our students if we see that there is a need?
So we recommend that, one, we have all kinds of free materials that are available, whether schools want the actual physical copies. We have posters that can be hung. We have sort of small business outreach, kind of business card size outreach cards that can be given out at any time. So you're able to go to our website, you're able to order those pieces, have those handy, have those available. Sometimes it's just as simple as handing off that card to a student and letting them know that we exist. We also feel really strongly that our Let's Talk prevention curriculum is such a great way to really work with young people and to engage around such critical conversations and really helping young people be more prepared to deal with some of the difficult situations they may be facing when they're faced with having to make really critical decisions about their lives and where they may sleep at night, what choices they may be making. this curriculum is a very helpful means and mechanism to open up that dialogue and that kind of conversation as well. And so I think also remembering we are certainly here to ensure that youth who are considering running away are safe and have safe options and alternatives, but we are well positioned to really work with youth and to serve kind of wherever they are and whatever need they may have. Again, recognizing, and I think being able to tell young people, look, this is somewhere to reach out. You may not know what you need at the moment. You may not even know where your journey is going to go, or whether you leave home or you want to find alternatives. But here's a place and a space that's safe, confidential, and open at any time that you're ready to talk.
Thank you. So another question, we have actually quite a few questions. So going in order, do you feel that the increased number of 14 to 17-year-olds contacting NRS is due to the effectiveness of social media marketing?
Melissa, do you want to?
I know you have thoughts about that, so why don't you take this one?
Sure. I think yes and no. I think one of the things to also, I just want to, just a little side note there, the largest increase was actually under age, was below age 12. So we think, when we think about that, I'm not entirely convinced that that's solely based because of the increased social media activity. We really feel like the disconnect from schools in particular. So places, the school building, the classroom, the connection to teachers and the resources and support systems that are available in schools on a regular basis weren't available to so many young people, right, for such an extended period of time. So we do really think that has an influence. We think that the 2021 data will give us a little bit of a different picture, right? We're hungry for, we're so excited, which is a funny place to be, right? About when we can get our hands on this 2021 report, because we think it will speak to some of that. But we think part of it was influenced literally by the cutoff of access to some of the maybe more informal or non-traditional systems of support for youth. But we also do think that this direct commitment to having a very large, visible engagement on the internet through social media and on platforms that we know youth use has been incredibly effective in driving those young people to our services and support. So it's sort of a little bit of both.
So another question around social media, which has been addressed in the chat as well. But I still want to open it up for everybody to see and hear. For social media accounts, who is running them and how much money is spent on advertising to produce those outreach results? And then we do have one other question pending as well. Okay, so what we will say is the social media accounts that are the National Runaway Safe Line accounts are run. We have a communications team that is responsible for managing and overseeing that work. So, but what I want to emphasize is, because we've given some other presentations around this, we don't have a staff of 20. There's not, doing this specific work. We have 1 to 2 people who are tasked with focusing on this specific work. It is not their full-time responsibilities. So it is part of kind of a range of things that they do, because we are been asked that extensively as well. In terms of cost, one of the nice things about using social media platforms are most are set up, you sort of pay as you go. So you're able to, you can put $100, for example, on an account, and you pay as people click and as people use those services. So it's not an investment that then, if nobody sees it, you've had to make this advertising investment that people aren't seeing. So that's been a really great way for us to be able to manage a fairly small budget around sort of a pretty massive campaign. There are varying prices across the board in terms of the cost. Some of those channels are more expensive than others.
What we were able to do, and what I know our communications team would recommend, is that you sort of pick amounts to invest across these channels. You keep an eye on them, and if one's more successful, you kind of put those resources, you move them over to what's working. So we were able to readjust. We knew that TikTok was working best, so we were able to make adjustments and sort of work around that. So if that, it's a pay as you go, which is great. And I think the other thing is it's also that ability to really target market. So you don't have to take, if you're not a national organization, you don't have to target every community in every city in every state. If you want to specifically target a certain age group and area within your own community, it's a far smaller investment, if that makes sense. But we are happy offline to go into more detail on that as well.
Okay, so we're going to take one more question. I wonder if it would be possible to track contacts by family income. And just the comment around it is that one would expect that wealth would be protective. Slicing the data by family income level could have lots of policy implications.
So we ourselves don't collect much identifying information at that level at all about the youth that that we're working with. What I will say is we are able to drill down by area code. So, and sometimes by zip code, depending on, we only have certain portions of youth who provide more detailed information. And by that, what I mean is if you are using the Home Free program, for example, we get a lot of identifying information about a young person. That is because we are really checking and making sure before we put a 15-year-old on a Greyhound bus to travel all across the country for 3 days to get home, that we're verifying where they're going, that it's a safe place for them to go, et cetera. So we collect a lot more data. So we have that kind of information, but we're able to really drill down particularly by area code and areas of the country. And so, for example, and I will just take this. I know we took a look, for example, at the state of Illinois at one point recently, and we were able to see where some of the growth was and where we were tracking. And we were seeing some of that growth and tracking going up the North Shore and into some of the north suburbs, which I think, which does give us some idea of some of the shifts and some of the reality that youth, regardless of income, are facing crisis and challenges. But then when we overlay that with the data that Melissa shared at the very beginning and the Voices for Youth count data that we have, we know though that the odds and the likelihood just increases exponentially depending upon sort of where income level, certain circumstances, certain marginalized communities, et cetera. But Melissa, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I think that's right. There are opportunities to look more into the geographic distribution of some of the challenges that are emerging. As Susan mentioned, we have aspirations for digging into these data further. And as Susan mentioned, looking at the 2021 data, I think there's a lot still to learn. And this question of the geography of opportunity and resources that exist across families and communities is a really important one.
Thank you both to Susan and Melissa for presenting this information and answering it. Thank you guys for participating. We have some closing remarks and comments, so I'm going to turn it over to Debbie Powell.
Thank you so much, Renee. And thank you, Susan and Melissa, for the very beneficial information and data shared with us today. I want to share that NRS is a very beneficial resource for organizations serving homeless youth, and we welcome and encourage you to take advantage of the many free resources available to you through NRS. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the Administration for Children and Families Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Julian Chang for closing remarks. Deputy Assistant Secretary Chang joined the Biden administration in February 2021 after serving as a senior deputy director at the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services Children's Services Agency, where she provided senior leadership for the state's child welfare system, including Children's Protective Services, the foster care system, adoption services, and juvenile justice programs. Join me in welcoming Deputy Assistant Secretary Chang for closing remarks.
Great, thank you, Debbie. Thanks to everyone who is on a part of this conversation for all that you do to support young people experiencing crisis and who are at risk for runaway episodes or youth homelessness. I also want to thank you for joining ACF in our efforts to move our work further upstream to try and prevent runaway episodes and intervene earlier. We can only be successful in moving our system upstream if we do this work together. As Debbie mentioned, my name is Julian Chang, and I'm the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary here at ACF. But really, I have spent the bulk of my career, over 20 years, really working on child welfare issues. And my passion is to try and really focus on a prevention lens to the work that we do. I was really struck by something Melissa said earlier about how if we cannot prevent homelessness, we want it to be brief and one time. That is absolutely the right approach. And the reason I feel so passionately about young people who are at risk of runaway and homelessness is because they are the same kids that we eventually see in the child welfare system, or they have come from the child welfare system. And so I want to just reiterate that, like child welfare, this is not a private family issue. Running away episodes and youth homelessness are public health challenges that impact young people nationally, especially young people from vulnerable populations. I just want to really highlight that this virtual discussion highlighted so many of the reasons why young people consider running away, including family dynamics, peer pressure, mental health, as well as abuse and neglect. We know that youth who run away to escape these situations without really fully understanding what they're putting themselves at risk for while living on the streets or couch surfing, and without any support, the many supports that you offer them, they are likely to experience homelessness. So we must do more to prevent this from happening, because we know that youth who experience homelessness are likely to face a whole host of additional challenges, including mental illness, substance abuse, physical and sexual abuse than their housed peers. They're often stigmatized, and youth experiencing housing instability can unknowingly fall victim to violence, exploitation, and human trafficking. They remain invisible in our community as they seek support to meet their basic needs. We know that the pandemic also has had an outsized impact on vulnerable young people, whether it's that a young person remains at home or in their current living arrangement with an abuser or other potentially unsafe living situation, something that was highlighted in this report. We also learned today about the impact of COVID-19 on young people who seek help, right? Whether it's that they can't find any available beds in a shelter, whether it's not having access to transportation to safe housing, and heightened anxiety and limited access to support systems, such as case management or other resources that could be found in schools that may have been closed. And tragically, we saw too many young people die from suicide and fall victim to other mental health related issues, including a risk in contacts from youth under the age of 12 and an overall increase in the level of intensity and length of time needed for each crisis connections. These are concerning challenges that we all have to work with. And so I want to call all of us to work together to do a couple of things. There is a need to continue this conversation about running away incidents and how communities can work together, whether it's child welfare agencies, youth serving agencies, schools, public health organizations, and others to prevent and address youth homelessness beyond National Runaway Prevention Month. Key to addressing the needs of this vulnerable population is building and fostering collaborations and partnerships that support families, children, and youth to reduce and end youth homelessness. We must also focus national efforts on preventing runaway incidents. There are often missed opportunities for preventing a crisis from escalating, which leads young people to leave home in the first place. We need to make sure that we are doing all we can to make sure that young people are aware of national resources like the National Runaway Safe Line that can help them find safe and stable housing, access emotional support, develop a plan, or reunite safely with their families. ACF remains committed to supporting youth at risk and those who have experienced homelessness. We promise to work hand in hand with all of our national partners, many of whom are on this call, local, state, and other federal agencies, to create opportunities to continue this conversation about young people at risk of runaway and homelessness experiences. We will examine and address the pathways to youth homelessness to ensure that all young people can have opportunities to thrive by addressing some of these root causes of homelessness, racial disparities, and access to supportive services when needed. And we do that because we want to make sure that every single young person has what they need and deserve, and that is a loving community, connection, and family. So I invite you to join ACF and FISB in our efforts to continue to prevent and end youth homelessness in all of our communities across the country. As I close, I just want to give a special thanks to Susan Frankel at National Runaway Safe Line for the extraordinary work that you did to produce this report, and all of our partners nationwide who are part of our runaway and homeless youth programs. With over 600 of you, I can't name you all individually, but just want to thank you for your incredible passion and commitment to these young people. We are honored to work alongside of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Deputy Assistant Secretary Chang. I echo your words, and I hope today's discussion has provided insight on the needs of young people experiencing homelessness and helps us to reflect and rethink strategies as we continue our work towards ending youth homelessness. I thank everyone again for joining us today, and please remember, while the National Runaway Prevention Month campaign comes to a close today, our work must continue throughout the year. We at the Family and Youth Services Bureau encourage communities across the country to continue shining the light in support of runaway and homeless youth in our communities. Thank you. Have a wonderful and safe day and a safe holiday.